The lecture is titled Imagining Institutions Otherwise, Lessons from Artivists' Experiments. And it's a pleasure to have Chiara de Cesari here with us, who's a professor of heritage, memory, and cultural studies at the University of Amsterdam. And she leads a Dutch Research Council-funded project called Imagining Institutions Otherwise. And, well, we can go on and on. I had a bit more bio, but I feel in the interest of time, the floor is yours, Chiara.
Thank you. I'm usually someone who takes a lot of time and who usually makes a lot of detours. But in this case, for the sake of time, I'll try to really stick to my text, which is something that I don't usually do, and I find it quite boring because I like to get lost, and I theorizing, meandering, and erring as a methodology. But again, I'll try to stick to the text, but please, if I'm too fast and, yes, oh, that's already. If I'm too fast, let me know. And probably for the sake of time, I might skip the last section, which is about the current political moment, and I wanted to share some of my ongoing thinking, but perhaps this can be done, you know, over the break, you know, and over food later on. So this is the structure of my talk today, the introduction. And in the introduction, I'm going to talk about the ImagineArt research project, which is finishing this month. We will have an amazing, I really like the program, final symposium at the Apple on June 16th. We are circulating the invites these days. I very warmly invite you to join us. And then I will talk about artistic practices as essentially laboratory for the radical political imagination, for thinking policies and polities. And then I'm going to have a rather theoretical section on sort of concepts that have been used to talk about the stuff that you talked about today and that we work with in ImagineArt, institutional infrastructural critique, and what we call radical imaginative trans-institutionalism. And of course, I'll talk about some of the key case studies that we work with. And then at the end, if we have time, but perhaps over the break, we can talk about the question of, you know, the current conjuncture and what it means. Okay. So institutions and instituting has long been a critical area of inquiry for theorists and researchers from across a variety of disciplines, as well as artists, curators, activists, artivists, and cultural workers. This engagement with institutions and with the broader socio-institutional framework of art as an aesthetic political objects for critical and representation, intervention, and action. And I'm talking about, of course, I mean, that's the topic of this conference, artistic engagement with institutions, material institution, large or small, cultural or otherwise, specific sites, or as well generic logics and patterns guiding human behavior and interaction. This engagement arguably carries profound implications for social movement and political theory, as well as for efforts to rethink the institutions we inhabit, such as universities, museums, and cultural institutions of various kinds. The ultimate goal is to navigate the current polycrisis, a convergence of environmental, social, and political emergencies, towards decolonization, demodernization, and degrowth. So in this talk, I explore the intersections between those artistic concerns and instituting practices and the project of creating more just institutions through more capacious, future-oriented political visions, developed outside of the narrow domain of politics, strictly conceived. My insights stem from the ImagineArt project on imagining institutions otherwise, art politics and state transformation. Our detailed ethnographic research in Imagine Art examines how artists and cultural workers, collectives, experiment with instituting in diverse contexts, particularly where traditional institutional infrastructures have dissolved due to shift in state forms, functions, and governance. Imagine Art has investigated a variety of creative counter-institutions in Palestine, Italy, Hungary, Indonesia, Germany, South Africa, and the Kurdish diaspora. These are artist-run, mostly grassroots spaces and projects that set up socio-institutional experiments based on principles of collaboration, horizontality, and resource sharing. These projects mobilize artistic practices to reconfigure organizational forms and reimagine self-organized collective life, modes of being and working together according to ideas of social justice and freedom. Imagine Art's main proposition is that these socio-artistic experiments produce an institutional otherwise in the here and now that may prefigure the future of cultural and other institutions. In other words, my point and the point of the whole Imagine Art research project is to examine social practice, socially engaged art, and instituting practices as generative platform for the radical political imagination, something that we dearly miss in the current neo- or post-fascist, genocidal, ecocidal conjuncture. Quickly about Imagine Art, these are the sort of members of the group who have been part of Imagine Art officially, but then we have had a really big group of people, very generous people with whom we have worked and collaborated in many different settings. And I won't have too much time to go into this, but all of our so-called case studies, they are not really case studies because very often is the people also we work, our friends, and they are not, kind of the traditional ethnographic subjects in the sense of, traditional colonial anthropology. So the problem, just very shortly, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the original setup of the project and how it changed. The project was actually originated in two very specific political experiences. One is the 1990s movement of so-called cultural squats in Italy and partly Berlin as well, which is a time in European history and I would say European/global political history that tends to be regarded as sort of a moment of sort of reaction and in a way kind of a form of counter-reformation in comparison to the 1960s and the 1970s and socio-political movements. But in fact, I think there were kind of a lot has not been said about sort of the ways in which certain spaces in the 1990s in Europe, in places like in several Italian cities where I grew up and in Berlin, where I moved to, do represent a very interesting and politically generative experience of being and working together, thinking about how to be together differently in a context of political hopelessness by mobilizing different kinds of aesthetics, tools, and experiences. So the idea of Imagine Art, this is Rome, and that's the Teatro Valle. And in 2000, now I have a moment, 2012, yes. And the idea of Imagine Art was that artistic practices are key to protest against state oppression and experimentations with new form of what we call counter-states, and that's artist-run collectives and cultural worker collectives are creating very generative counter-institutions, but on the one hand, state theory and political theory completely neglects this form of experimental institutionalism, and on the other hand, theories of aesthetics and politics normatively assume that art produces social change. So the idea of Imagine Art was to think about those experiments, despite their alleged small scale, as site for thinking the political, but not as normative theory, like art produces social change. Well, is it really true? The idea was to look into actually what people do on the ground and how political experiment works. How do they what do they do? Why do they succeed? Why do they fail? What's the meaning of success and failure? And failure has been a very key problem for Imagine Art in many ways. Other fundamental place, it's Palestine. This is the Palestinian Art Academy, and a particular moment in the recent Palestinian history. This is like between the, let's say, end of the Second Intifada, around early 2000 in Ramallah, up to the 2010, where for various reasons and in very interesting ways, a very very interesting and cultural political scene and very vibrant emerged, particularly in the West Bank, and then kind of circulated in the diaspora, that was producing institutional experiments that that for me it was hard not to connect to other forms of experimentation, such as the one I was coming from, and that I think produced really very interesting ways, and not only to think about art, but for me to think about politics and thinking about the how to think the future, how to think the impossible at a time when, we are told every time that there is no impossible, and the impossible is impossible, and that there is only a very narrow reality of the possible. And we thought these kind of experiments could point at experimentations with producing political visions, practical political visions in the present that had also kind of, could play an important role for the futures. And the idea was to look at how they worked in practice. And the idea was to focus on the intersection between these institutional experiments and what at the time some people used to call micro-utopias, and the state. Because usually these experiments are considered as something very far from the state, and my idea and the idea of Imagine Art that actually we see those experiments as the seeds of counter states in the present that, are small scales, have lots of problems, but at the same time do provide some I don't like the idea of practical testing grounds, but places where we, in a way, can practice utopia in the present in very highly imperfect ways, and yet arguably very important in terms of making space for thinking in a way the impossible or the future, or something that is beyond the narrow, horrendous and violent constraints of our current realities. Couple of case studies, the main one, Italy, Hungary, the Palestinian territories, Palestine and Lebanon, Indonesia, South Africa, and then also we worked with also a lot with the organizations in the Kurdish diaspora. And the idea was also to understand how those artist collectives, social institutional experiments relate differently to different forms of state transformation, post-socialist, neoliberal, post-colonial, and now post-liberal. Some photos of case studies that I won't talk about in the rest of my talk, the Off Biennale Budapest, and a series of artist collectives in Indonesia. Now I don't have time to go into that, think about Ruang Rupa and Kunci, Tarimpadi, and so on and so forth. Now, a couple of important concepts for Imagine Art that have changed throughout those years. We began thinking in terms of anticipatory representation. This was a concept that I developed in relation to my work with Palestinian cultural and heritage organizations and Palestinian artists in particularly Ramallah, and that emphasized vis-a-vis prefiguration emphasize sort of in a way the creative, well, creative is a terrible name, in a way the radical imaginative potential of representation. And Khalil Rabas, Palestinian Museum of Natural History and Humankind at the Athens Biennial, is a very good example of this kind of anticipatory representation. The other notion that we are working a lot now is this idea of trans-institutionalism, and which underscore the crucial role of loose transnational networks of artists, activists, researchers, theorists, cultural workers in buildings, institutions, otherwise, and in a way, I guess, we are sort of that. And at the moment in Imagine Art, we're thinking about, in a way, us and what we do also in terms of trans-institutionalism in different ways. And the other sort of core term that we work with in Imagine Art is the idea of what we sort of called practice theorizing during our workshop at Documenta 15, or the practical imagination, to emphasize this, to underscore the ways in which we're talking about profoundly entangled practices, like what we do in the sort of today, that are both simultaneously theory and practices. So the here and now, this concrete moment of us thinking about instituting, but also sort of the futures and several elsewheres. So, and the idea was really to try to, I have to say, the project was not only, or not a project of a research project in the sense a project that just studied collectives, artists, and cultural workers, collective social institutional experiments. Sort of the idea of the project was also to, so for us, the understanding of practice theorizing means that sort of you are, in a way, in the picture, and that the idea is that knowledge and knowledge production is part of that sort of entanglement of theory and practice and that exchange of ideas. So it's really not, we are there and the experiments are our case studies and we look at them from above, but you know, they are part of our daily life, and those are the places where we try to think with some joy what we could do to build a better present for us, and also that, you know, a present that is not so constrained by the possible. So just a couple of examples of radical imaginative trans-institutionalism and anticipatory representation, and also practice theorizing, are Palestinian cultural organizations and the extensive alliances that build among themselves and with many other companions, collectives, and organizations across worlds. Before the genocide, despite the brutal Israeli occupation and the relentless colonization of Palestinian lands, a vibrant cultural scene flourished, particularly in the West Bank. And now it's kind of, I think it's interesting. Well, it's a long story, but I would have liked for us to think about the destruction of cultural scenes, which means also the destruction of our own ecosystems, and how to think about that. But this is perhaps a question for, I don't know, the coffee break or the food. So over time, Palestinian artist collectives, cultural spaces, smaller and larger museums, galleries, and all kinds of organizations have built a common infrastructure unified by a shared participatory ethos and sort of this goal of working, creating community and creating infrastructures. I think one of the most interesting thing and one of the most interesting aspect of some of the, a lot actually, I would argue, of the pioneering artistic experiments that have taken place in Palestine and in the Palestinian diaspora is this idea of there is no state, the state has been destroyed, has been occupied, or has been dismantled, and therefore people in a way take the responsibility to build in a way counter-state infrastructure that both do in a way carry out some of the functions of the state and at the same time radically refigure them. Just something quickly about how this work works. That's interesting. Khalil Rabas, yeah.
Be mindful of the mic.
Oh, yes. Yes. So quickly, I'm going to talk about two examples, and then, again, examples is not the right term, two practices that we work with, and we have been working with for a long time. One is by Khalil Rabas, who has been working on establishing Palestinian cultural institutions that both function simultaneously as real institutions, as real museums, as real biennial. He together with an organization called RIWAC, Khalil set up the very first Palestinian biennials in the mid-2000s. It was the first biennial was 2005. So in a way, the making of the biennial, the making of the Museum of Natural History and Humankind is both about establishing a real institution that does cultural work, but those projects also function simultaneously as an artwork. So you see this here. So in a way, Khalil's Palestinian Museum of Natural History is both a real museum, but is also an artwork. And in a way, you cannot disconnect the two, because the kind of institutional work that Khalil's project do fundamentally operates through the aesthetic device of it being presented as an artwork and in a way working as an artwork. This is Khalil has done several instantiations of the project, and this project has, created, auctions in the West Bank, created the seeds or fragments, kind of shards of an institutional infrastructure, like, for example, doing auctions, creating newsletters, organizing lectures, organizing exhibitions, and those were the years 2000 and early 2000. That was the time when, particularly West Bank cities like Ramallah had been relatively recently reoccupied. So it was really a countercultural scene in the sense that it was countering a military occupation, not at the borders of Ramallah, but right in the center of the city. This is also Venice Biennial 2009. It's a very complex work. I love it. And basically, Khalil, he launched the Palestinian Biennial during the Venice Biennial of 2002, performed the work of, performed his role as artistic director of RIWAC, which is a Palestinian cultural heritage organization and cultural organization, and his role as biennial organizer as part of his contribution to the first Palestinian pavilion. And through that, the presentation of this work, both his museum, his work as RIWAC director, and the biennials is being augmented and magnified through the mobilization and the hacking, if you wish. Some people criticize me for using hacking. Sometimes I use it just to get my ideas across. So this idea that you hack in international, very powerful, very prominent platforms, and you use it to do other stuff. And this other stuff is institutional work in Palestine. So it's the work of building a cultural infrastructure in a place where there is none. or actually it was destroyed. This is the Palestinian Art Academy, very interesting story. It was sort of born as literally a workshop of artists going around, I think also Gaza, the time it was possible. No, probably not. I don't remember, but for sure going around the West Bank and doing sort of workshops with all kinds of artists. And over the year has become, first it was the only art academy in Palestine operating independently from the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure of the Palestinian Authority, and doing a lot of, sorry, this is now going on, lots of interesting projects. And then after lots of internal discussions, it decided to join the Birzeit University and becoming the Faculty of Art. And I had put this slide here originally because I wanted us to talk about sort of the struggle within let's say, creative, imaginative, social institutional sort of experiments, and the fundamental struggle around how much do you want to institutionalize. You need some form of, I would say, institutional pattern and some form of institutional infrastructure, and yet when it becomes too much, and when a project is incorporated by the state, I hope you remember the slide that I showed before, very often actually always becomes something else. And the sort of the emancipatory social justice potential, sort of liberatory in the sense of liberation, the potential of liberation, those projects gets kind of tamed or diminished, to say the least. The other, yes. Yes, I just went astray. I want to talk about another project, which is also a project that I care very much, that I'm very kind of attached to. This is a project in the periphery of Rome. I don't know if some of you have been there, have seen it. And essentially, this is the MAM, the Museum of the Other and the Elsewhere. And fundamentally, this is both a museum and a squat, because what happened here, early 2010, there was a group of families squatted this building in the periphery of Rome that risked getting evicted. Anthropologists and artists connected to the project came up with the idea of using the device of the museum to protect people from being evicted. So what they did, they put out a call for artists to donate their work of art and bring it to the space of the MAM, because the idea was the police will not evict the people, will not destroy MAM if there is a lot of contemporary art in it. And it did work. This is in a way, okay, what's the measure of success and failures is, of course, a question mark, and it's something that I think needs to be thought about very carefully. But the MAM, in a way, has been successful in the sense that it has produced the third largest contemporary art collection in Rome, and street art mostly, but it includes stuff like, Michelangelo Pistoletto and, very kind of important work, and it has never been evicted. And now, some people would argue that it has been incorporated into the state and co-opted by the state, like the Palestinian Art Academy becoming part of Birzeit Faculty of Art, because, and I was talking to some people, some of the people involved, and they were like, well, it's this question, did we win or did they win? By they meaning the local government, the local municipality, because now this is going to become a museum, and the people here are going to be moved to a series of social housing, like a social housing development that is being built already. I think it's just started around close to the MAM, but not in the MAM. And I think the good thing was that social housing project is not going to be only for the people who are living in the MAM now, but is a much broader project, and in the sense that's the victory. But we could also reflect on the ways in which, in a way, the victory and the success of MAM reproduced a strict division of function between the museum, which is a space, in a way, of the dead, sort of dead stuff, and not of a space of habitation. While I think that indeed there was a sort of really something very powerful in the idea of sort of, you know, the museum being part of a living space. This is also the MAM, and sorry. So as a sociocultural anthropologist, and to conclude, as a sociocultural anthropologist and a cultural studies scholar, my primary concern is really not with the implication of this shift from representation to actualization for art itself. And now I don't think this is I wrote this sentence rather for sort of for the very few times when I speak to a more let's say, mainstream arts audience, which is very rare, but I always try to make it the point that, in a way, I don't care about whether is this art or not art, and I don't care whether this is art or not, because I'm not an art historian, and I don't create taxonomies and the canon, but also because I think those works work in a different ways. And what is important for me is to understand what does it happen when political and social projects present themselves, unfold, and function also as artworks, and in the space of, in the domain that one would call art. And sort of what kind of agency, what imaginative force does this device, this label of art, confer upon them? I suspect that these features are also very important. So I'm not an art historian, but I think these features are very important to understand how instituting practices work. And also because it seems to me that here really the point is not, is this art or not, which was also the question of course, of Documenta 15, but really to use art in the sense of arte utile, to do the kind of the work of the imagination that we need in the present in order to first conceive, test, and then implement social institutional change. And I'll leave it at that. And I really would hope that, just as a final note, that we would like to talk to all of you about the question of the current conjuncture and the relationship between and the impact of the current conjuncture, meaning neo-fascism, post-fascism, genocide and ecocide, and what some call post-liberalism in relation to what we do and the ecosystems that we live in, contributes to, and that I believe are very important, you know, to sustain also life today, and to sustain and give a concrete meaning to hope and political visions. Thank you.
Just to give people some time and to put Gareth on the spot again, I mean, the plan was to have an exchange of each other's presentations, but unfortunately, Chiara didn't see yours. So I wanted to just start the conversation by getting your thoughts on how that resonated with how you're thinking about Flat Time House and this idea of anticipatory representation through institutionalizing a space such as a space that is an artwork. And what other concepts and ideas resonated with your practice? And then we can gather some of the questions of the public.
Thank you. Well, I think I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you. I think the overlaps with Artist Placement Group for me felt very apparent. The use of art and the institution as a strategy, as like a tool to change. Because I also feel that John Latham wasn't particularly interested in art. He was interested in what art could do, or how to use it. And so through his art making, he wasn't really interested in the object made, but the message that he was communicating and how that could be used for social change. So that was often very abstract in trying to change the way that people thought. But through that thinking and through how that type of practice was implemented in the artist placement group led to some of the very practical examples that I mentioned, such as prison reform and such like. I think where artist placement group had some difficulties was kind of in the utopian kind of aspiration of what they were trying to do. Like, go to policymakers, go to the head of these, the people who informed what governments do and how we live, and wanting to really change society, change how society thinks. And so it was really wonderful to hear some examples from you in very pragmatic terms and practical terms of how these have been implemented by different groups and different organizations.
Thank you. Any questions? Guy. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, both, thanks to both of you for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's really a pity that Chiara couldn't unfold more large and deeply, because it was really wonderful how it was going. But I want to take it from where you ended, dear Chiara, on the point of whether it's art or not, which is also in relation with what Gareth just said, in relation of the thinking about art as kind of vehicle somehow to impact that imagination. But then my question is more about, I wonder if we can really get completely away from the idea of the making as a performative element in relation to produce the space of imagination to a community, unless we, into your speeches, both of your presentation, you were speaking more contextually and therefore meaning Western context, where the relation to what you might call art or non-art is already very, let's say, dismantled. If you are in a little town somewhere in Cameroon, for example, where I originate, I wonder if you could have the same discourse in relation to, by saying it's not really matter whether it's art or not. I don't know if that kind of resonates to you.
Can you make a concrete example? Because I would say, I mean, first of all, again, it's probably because I'm not an art historian nor an artist. I don't care whether something is art or not. And because I don't care, but also because I think that's not the point. Which doesn't mean that I'm saying that the policing of the boundaries between art and non-art are not heavily policed and do not matter in the sense of having material impact. But I sort of, what I'm trying to do is, on the one hand, move away from like a narrowly instrumental understanding of, oh, these people are just using art, sort of our beautiful art, to do politics. It feels, the kind of dismissive tone of this is an instrumentalization of art that sort of, in a way, it's kind of petty, or like it's not. And I really want to kind of, I think in a way that's more, if you wish, for me, this is even more sublime art, because it doesn't care about the kind of boundary, and actually beyond that plays with that boundary performatively and try to shift it, because the politics is in the shifting. And sorry to answer directly, this is a little bit to give a background, because sometimes in certain, especially in academia, some people understand me as, this notion of arte utile in a way as very kind of narrowly instrumentalist. And this is not the point, because this is for me the point of producing powerful and joyful visionary spaces where we live and work and where we can imagine the future while living the present in a decent way, instead of always being depressed and having all kinds of problems. But in relation to your question, again, my experience is very strongly shaped by the spaces and the experiences that I went through. And one is, now I didn't grow up in Rome, but the kind of mom experiences when I was very young and I was still living in Italy, and then Palestine, and now the Netherlands. In Palestine, a lot of these artists, and again, please don't take this as me not saying Khalil is not producing sublime art. I think he is, and he shows in a kinds of, in the most elitist spaces of contemporary art. And I think I don't know how much his work costs, but I think it's not little. But what I'm saying is that, for example, Khalil did work that matter very much to people in, for example, Hebron. That's a city that's where I lived for a while, and that's it's like, it's difficult to convey the reality of Hebron and the southern West Bank. Perhaps you hear in the news because the people of the southern West Bank and of Hebron are constantly threatened with their houses being demolished, their kids being beaten, not blocked on the way to school, killed, and so, and their house literally being either demolished or taken away from them when they go back. And I saw the work of Khalil being very meaningful to people in Hebron. And also, what I'm saying is that people who live in the MAM are certainly not, it's not an art public. I mean, it's beautiful because you really see, I like that photo because I took, because their kids were playing in there. So they're certainly not, their parents, I think the mom has been, well, now not, but when it started, they probably, for many, not all, but the mom was the first museum that they had been to. So this is why, I don't know, maybe but this is what I think, sorry, it takes me a long time sometimes that's meandering my way of thinking. What I'm saying is that this is also what, for me, what's important is the specificity. I really would like to move away from normative statements and a normative way of thinking like, oh, art produces social change everywhere in the same way. So I really think that specific genealogies, specific political cultures, specific histories produce certain kind of settings and interaction, which doesn't mean that those worlds are separated, because they are interconnected, But at the same time, I don't know, but this is my experience. Maybe, how is it in Cameroon, or like...
No, I mean, I completely get it, and you really put it right. I mean, then we are on the same line in the sense, my question was also to kind of clarify the fact that in certain contexts, actually, the idea of knowing that we are dealing with someone who is an artist and who is not a politician, or who is not, I don't know, whatsoever, a sociologue, makes it kind of more easy to enter in communication with the community, and therefore to bridge that type of imaginary we want to work toward collectively. And in certain contexts, you definitely cannot arrive and directly affirming that is not art, or I'm not an artist, or is something we don't know what it is. So it's kind of, that's kind of the how can I put it, that gaps there somehow to start from somewhere, which might be narrow, or which might be understanding in a very bourgeois way, giving the context, but in some contexts it's quite important for people to first have that kind of precision and move on from there. That's how I was putting it.
No, I fully agree with you, but in a way, I think what's interesting here is that you have both, and I think that's the point, that's the tactic, and that's excellent, and it's both aesthetic and political, it's a matter of political aesthetics, is to both kind of mimic the boundaries, in a way perform the artists, perform the politicians, so both mimic, perform them, and disrupt them, and completely mess them up, because clearly, and I think those sort of categories, I mean, it's a long story, you know, demodernize and so on, is based on this idea that you don't have art, those sort of categories of through which modernism and coloniality have ruled the world are something that I believe we should disrupt. But I think you cannot say the distinction between art and politics doesn't matter. It does matter a lot, even though I think it's not there. And I think performing and playing with those categories, that's kind of the trick.
I'm really sorry to have to wrap this up because I know there were many more questions. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Chiara.